All right, greetings everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our first live stream ever with the Indiana Catholic Conference. Today's event will have a couple of very dignified speakers joining us to talk about Laudato Si, one of the Holy Father's recent encyclicals. He wrote it in 2015. And just a couple of housekeeping things as you're joining us here. Please post your questions in the comment section for the live stream, and we'll get to those at the end. We'll have about 5 minutes at the end. We'll be going until about 12:45, just so you can plan if you're doing this on your lunch break. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to join us. For those of you who know of people that can't make it, that couldn't do this time, we are going to post this recording on our YouTube page. So do not fear, and feel free to spread the word and share this with people after we're done with our live stream today. And also, I know that those of you listening in, that's great, but if you know of somebody who wasn't able to come to this one, we still have 3 weeks after this where we'll be doing the same thing. So you can go ahead and let people know that they don't have to attend all of them in order to get something out of it. Each event stands as its own thing. By way of introduction, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Alexander Mingus. I'm the Associate Director of the Indiana Catholic Conference. I just want to mention one thing about why we're doing this, and then I'll turn it over to our Executive Director. But you might be wondering, why does the ICC, in our work throughout the non-legislative session time, why are we reading a church document and trying to dive into it a little bit more? Well, it's because these documents, the church's social doctrine, makes up the basis and the foundation for the positions we take when interacting with our state government. And so this is very important for us as staff to learn, to reflect on, to pray with. And so as we're doing that, we want to invite others into that prayer and reflection as well. And so that's why we have this discussion today. And hopefully in future years, we'll have similar discussions on other topics, other documents of the church's social teaching. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Angela Espada. She's the Executive Director of the Indiana Catholic Conference.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished guest. First, we have Dr. Phil Sakimoto. He's a professor at Notre Dame. He's been there for 16 years. Prior to joining Notre Dame, he was at NASA. He has very qualified to be there. He has a master's as well as a PhD in astronomy. He is also a professor of the practice in physics at Notre Dame, as well as the director of the minor in sustainability. Joining him, we have Archbishop Charles Thompson. He comes to Indianapolis by way of Louisville, Kentucky, and he recently just celebrated 2 anniversaries. His anniversary of being ordained 10 years ago as a bishop, and then as Archbishop. One of those was in June, and then the other anniversary was just July, just a couple of weeks ago. We could spend this entire time talking about the accomplishments and credits and the service that these 2 men have given to promote the common good and understanding. But we won't do that. We will jump into our questions after the Archbishop leads us in prayer.
And I'm going to take the prayer that Pope Francis gives us in his encyclical itself. Let us pray. Father, we praise you with all your creation, with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light you guide this world toward the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awake our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor in the earth are crying out, O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. And we add St. Francis and St. Clare. Pray for us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll jump in with our first question. In the introduction to Laudato Si, Pope Francis discusses the work of his predecessors, St. John Paul II, Pope Paul VI, Pope Benedict, and their views and concerns about the ecology. Why is this point critical to understanding the Church's teaching or cure for the creation?
Pope Francis himself says it in the text itself that he wanted this to be added to the body of the Catholic social teaching of the Church, and to kind of connect it back to his predecessors, showing the consistency of this being an essential focus for us as Church. That it's not something brand new he's bringing about. That it's one of care for creation is one of the 7 key principles, core values of Catholic social teaching, and really these 7 principles. None of them live in a vacuum of one from the other. So care of creation is tied into our respect for life, our option for the poor, our sense of solidarity, the balance of rights and responsibilities. That list goes on. So it's to show that consistency and to add to the body. I will say that this is an encyclical which gives it a heightened sense of priority in that body of social teaching as well. Much of what Pope Francis has given us is through exhortations, exhorting us, encouraging us, whereas an encyclical means this is something that we need to really embrace. And so he's given us this, he's outlining from other popes before him, but then giving us this enhanced urgency of how this particular principle of our Catholic social teaching needs to be addressed, needs to be given great attention today. Not only by Catholics, but really he's addressing this to not only to Christians, but he's addressing this to all people of the earth, all people as we teach, created in the image of God.
And I think also reminding us, as you said, that this isn't new. This
Exactly.
is something that has been brought up before,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe not with the urgency or the importance of an encyclical.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sakimoto, would you like to add to that?
Well, just briefly, I think it's really important to understand this long history of the Church in terms of care for creation that goes back centuries, because it emphasized the point that our current concerns, certainly driven by the current state of our planet and environment, it's not a new fad, it's not driven by political considerations. We're just acting in the way that the Church Fathers have asked us to act for generations. Maybe with more of an emphasis now because of current crises, but it's not new.
I think that's an important point because so often we can be divided by politics, and you make an important point by saying this isn't driven by politics, this is something that's been around for a long time. Thank you for that. Dr. Sakimoto, we'll start with you on the next question. In the first chapter, the Holy Father mentions the throwaway culture that contributes to ecological harm. What does this have to do with the environment and human life?
Well, if all creation is a gift, when we abuse the gift, we disrupt its function. And we live in an ecosystem that runs a natural cycle, right? Water cycle, carbon cycle, oxygen cycle. You learned about all these things in middle school, I presume. But when we disrupt cycles by taking what we want without replenishing them, then we diminish the Earth's ability to sustain us. Okay? Our use of fossil fuels is a good example. We dig them out of the Earth, we burn them, which of course puts carbon dioxide in the air, disrupts the climate, and then eventually we'll run out of them. And if we don't do something else, that will end our current lifestyles that are so dependent on having abundant energy. Renewable energy is a counterexample. It's renewable. Solar power, wind power, if we use them to provide the energy for our lifestyles, they will sustain us for literally as long as the sun shines. And using them does not disrupt any of the natural cycles of nature. And so we're building a sustainable lifestyle, a lifestyle that we can continue for as long as the sun shines.
And then also with the throwaway culture and the connect to human life, Archbishop, you mentioned the dignity of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add to Dr. Sakimoto, said that very beautifully. And again, to reemphasize what he just said, the sustainability. That's the key, is the sustainability. But Pope Francis also mentions throughout the encyclical that in a throwaway culture, in anything where we're not appreciating the environment or caring for it, the first to be affected and most harmed are the poor. And one of those, in addition to the principle of the dignity of persons, also the church's preferential option for the poor, that we can't put our own luxuries or financial concerns ahead of that first option, and that is for the poor, for the vulnerable. And so this throwaway culture tends to affect the most vulnerable first, and we have to keep and really any nation, any society is only as credible as it cares for its most vulnerable persons in the society.
There was something, and I can't remember which chapter, but in a throwaway society, and talked about produce and how much we produce, but then how much we throw away. That a third of the food that we produce is thrown away. And the quote was something like, whenever we throw away, we're stealing from the table of the poor.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And when you think about it in that terms, maybe that will give people pause to not so easily slide into the habits of a throwaway culture. Dr. Sakimoto, we'll come back to you. The Holy Father discusses climate change and the effects. How have these effects changed in the 6 years since Laudato Si was written?
Climate change has gotten a lot worse in those 6 years, and worse in ways that are more profound and faster than we even thought they would be. I think you've all seen in the headlines this week that the IPCC, that is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a new report that's giving really dire warnings about the extreme dangers we're facing from climate change. But I'm here to tell you that's not new news. Within the scientific community, within the research papers that I read, we've known this for years and years. It takes time for new findings in the research community to come to the point where they become public knowledge and get in these government reports. So when you hear what seems from the news, a new announcement from the IPCC, no, we knew this was coming. We know how bad it is. And it's really time that we do something about it, because what we're doing as humans, the greenhouse gases we put in the air, are triggering a really nasty response from our planet. They're now seeing in large amounts methane belching out of the Arctic, out of Siberia. We're seeing nitrous oxides coming out of the oceanic Z zones. We're seeing even the Amazon rainforest, which we thought would be a sink for sequestering carbon. We see carbon dioxide now coming out of it just because the temperatures are getting so warm. And all of these things cause the warming of the Earth to accelerate faster and faster. So it causes extreme weather. You see in the news now every day reports of out-of-control wildfires, superstorms, flooding, droughts. So we're living in a crisis situation now. This is not something that we need to think about in terms of how bad will it be in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, or what do we need to do in the next decade or two, but rather we're in a crisis situation now, and that means a stringent action right now is absolutely necessary.
Hopefully we can, later toward the end, we can talk about some ways that as individuals we can start thinking about it now and actions that we can do. oftentimes it seems overwhelming and too big for one person, but I think if we are prayerful about it and listen to the experts, that we individually might be able to make some changes. So we look forward to having that discussion. I'll come back to you, Archbishop. Dr. Sakimoto talked about it's not a partisan issue, and it's so easy for people to try to see it through the lens of politics. Mm-hmm. Is there something that the church can do so that people can see this situation for what it is, that we should be stewards of this gift of the planet and do the best that we can to care for it?
Well, again, we reiterate as in our Catholic faith, we believe our discernment process involves both faith and reason. And so Dr. Sakimoto was talking about much of the science and what's that is part of our reason that we take to prayer. We have to, Pope Francis uses some wonderful words of accompaniment, dialogue, and encounter. And that's one of the great things of the Second Vatican Council, talking about how we have to dialogue with the sciences, with all the different types of sciences, physical science, behavioral science, and so forth. And so that's not a partisan thing. That's using our reason along with our prayer. And the church has a long-standing tradition of staying focused on issues, not on parties or candidates. And that's important for us to do, and to continue to our prayer discernment. If it's on the issue, our concern is not about parties or candidates. It's about what is the issue about life and responsibility. One of those key principles of Catholic social teaching is rights and responsibilities, and that for every right there's a corresponding responsibility. And we live in a culture, a society that very much quick to advocate our rights, our privileges, but we want to kind of somehow not think too much about the responsibility that coincides with that. And the care for creation, this whole notion of caring for the environment, for our creation, as Pope Francis points out time and again, it's how do we respect the environment? How do we, as we would respect one another? Because the environment, without the environment, we have no existence. And the understanding that the responsibility goes with that, with each and every right that we have. And the scriptures, it says, to those who have, more will be expected of them. And so those of us who live in countries who are have great resources and privileges, we have a responsibility to keep before us the poorest and the vulnerable. That's not partisan. That has nothing to do with politics. That has to do with what it means to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, what it means to be a child of God and a member of the human family that's been given the same home, as Pope Francis points out here, our common home that's reflected in the title of his encyclical itself.
You also mentioned, you said discernment, but then you said accompaniment. I think that's important. There's so often when people are trying to correct what they see as a wrong, such as, losses to the environment or degradation, people will jump in and do what they think is best. Something that sprung to my mind when you were saying that is, I remember in Africa there was a push for clean water, and they installed these huge, I guess for lack of a better way, a drill, but it had a huge wheel that had to be turned. While they didn't talk with the village, they didn't accompany them with their needs, they didn't realize that the women collected the water. And these women couldn't turn these huge iron wheels. And so all their efforts were for naught at the end because they couldn't be used. And so all of those things need to be together. We need to stop looking at it through a partisan lens. We need to have some discernment. We need to use the wisdom that's out there, and then we need to work together instead of trying to come from on high with the solution.
And Pope Francis says that we have to invite everyone to the table, and especially the most local people who are going to be affected. And he even warns that in the encyclical, that sometimes we think we're addressing a need and trying to fix it, and we create other needs because we haven't talked to the right people and the people that are going to be most affected by it, just like these women trying to gather the water.
Yeah. Dr. Sakimoto, would you like to comment on this? How we can maybe get beyond the political lenses so that we can have some success with this common problem?
Well, I think first of all, we as a church need to be more vocal about care for creation issues. I mean, this session we're doing right now is a good example of things that need to happen. Certainly the laity needs to become more vocal, but also the priesthood that we tend not to hear from the Pope. Talk that science is not a choice, because we're living in a world now where people seem to think that you can choose to believe the science or not believe the science. And to me that sounds absurd, because science is not a matter of opinion. What science is a careful look at what is actually happening in our physical world and reporting on it. And so what is there is there. You don't get a choice to think that climate change is real or not any more than you get a choice to obey the laws of gravity if you step off a tall building. It's there, it's the reality, and we need to make that clear. The other thing that keeps coming back to me is getting back to the issues of human dignity and right to life. Because when we talk about care for creation, we're talking about right to life issues that certainly encompass the usual things we talk about in terms of right to life, but much more, because now we're talking about the dignity of all life on earth, all people, all creatures, which is encompassing all of creation. And that's the way we should be thinking about what right to life really means.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, I heard just the other day, in all fairness, it wasn't in reference to climate change, but it was in reference to, the pandemic. Someone said, well, we have our own science. And like truth and facts, you can't have your own facts, you can't have your own truth, and you shouldn't have your own science, because science is science, truth is truth, facts are facts. And hopefully we'll be able to get back to that. Dr. Sakimoto, what does environmental degradation have to do with the breakdown of society? And why does the Holy Father tell us a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach?
Our approach to living, which is rooted in Western cultures, has actually an unusual approach to property. We think that we can take pieces of land and define ownership. We think that we can take certain resources and define ownership. But in fact, going back to the idea that creation is a gift, it belongs to everyone. And the people who lived in these lands before us, the indigenous people, knew that. They had no concept of private ownership. They understood that everything belonged to the Creator and shared it. So we need to move away from an economy that is based in greed and maximizing my own resources, my own money, and so forth, and get back to one that is what Christ actually asks of us, to live a life of love and generosity. So it's the very basic assumptions of our society that are actually the root cause of all the ecological problems we have now. All right? So replace the greed with love, replace the hoarding with sharing, and all these problems will take care of themselves.
If I may just add, and it kind of goes back to what you said right before Dr. Sakimoto answered that question, was the notion of the common good. Talking about the common good supersedes individual privilege, and I think that one of the things that's important for us as a church is always remember that the church speaks of objective truth, and in a culture today, a society that becomes more and more radical individualistic, where truth is based on my own, as you said earlier, in radical individualism, everyone's truth becomes, that subjective truth becomes the truth, and then there's no longer an objective truth. And without that objective truth, how do we have the proper dialogue and reasoning and understanding that truth, facts are beyond my own particular point of view, that there's something that holds us all together, and that truth, we believe, those immutable truths that are placed in our heart by God's very presence and existence in our lives. So I think that notion of objective truth is essential to our understanding of how the dialogue and how it's affecting us as a whole. I just think that's a key piece there to keep before us. The other thing I would add is, especially as Catholics, we talk about, we're a Eucharistic-centered people. The Eucharist is the source and summit of who we are, and the Eucharist comes from a Greek word that means to be grateful. And so, if we see the world as gift, if we have a grateful hearts to appreciate the world as gift and not as a sense of entitlement. And I think that's another piece that's important for us in how we move forward. And however we have all the different, as you said, it might seem overwhelming to try to change things on our own, but I think first place we have to start, I'm jumping ahead, but first place we have to start with grateful hearts, to see everything as gift, that all creation is gift, is blessing to me, and that I'm not entitled to abuse it. I'm not entitled to do whatever I want to it. And I think if we start with grateful hearts, that's one of the key ways that we start making the shift in our society and our culture towards that more respectful way of embracing all of creation. I know I'm jumping ahead, sorry.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to a thought that maybe that's why so many young people have embraced trying to save the planet, because they haven't been jaded, because they've learned that truth is truth. They haven't gotten to the point where they're trying to, make everything subjective, and that they still are young enough that they are in awe of this gift of the planet, and they're not going from a lens of greed or ownership or what's mine. And if we could, as Jesus, said in another setting, become more like children, maybe we'll be on the road to being able to help. I'm going to go to the next question, and this one is for you, Archbishop.
Okay.
In the Gospel of Creation, chapter 2, the Holy Father reflects on the gospel command to have dominion over the earth. And it seems that people take this to mean a variety of different things, but what is he saying, and how do we do this in a responsible, respectful manner?
Well, I think, again, going back to that one that I've mentioned a couple of times, that one key principle of Catholic social teaching, rights and responsibility. To have dominion over the earth means, I think a lot in our society we think of authority as power, and in the church, the authority is responsibility. So to have dominion, to have authority, means I have a responsibility to care for the earth, to care for the creatures, and not just see them as having that anything in creation, creatures, whatever, exist only for my wants. That I recognize the blessing, the giftedness of in its own right of creation, of creatures, and that I have a responsibility that as I enjoy them, that I draw nourishment and sustenance myself from creation, that I also understand the notion to care and to give back, to remember the generations that behind me, after me, that will need the benefit and the blessing and the grace of that creation beyond. So the dominion over the earth of creation reminds us that we have a responsibility to care for that, using both our faith and reason to make choices that are not self-centered, not selfish, but having that broader sense of humanity and the awe and wonder that we need to embrace the earth rather than misuse it.
I think so often when people hear dominion, they think that gives them the right to dominate, and they don't truly understand the meaning of the word as well as the context in which it was put.
Yep.
And I think we need to remind people of that. I'm going to...
If I could interject, I
of
think
course.
dominion is an unfortunate translation. Stewardship would be a much better word, because it implies caring and nurturing as opposed to being in charge and doing what you want.
Very good point. Yes, thank you.
Next question. The Holy Father writes, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. Rather, all creatures are moving forward with us and through us toward a common point of arrival, which is God, and that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illuminates all things. Is this the vision of creation a ploy to get us to worship the environment instead of God, or is it something entirely different?
I think it goes back to what I just said earlier, that we're not the center of the universe. you know, you know, if we keep God at the center of our universe, and as I say, as often as Catholics, to be Christ-centered rather than be self-centered or agenda-driven, and I think that's what the Holy Father is saying, that that when we're self-centered or agenda-driven, that's when we misuse creation and even other human beings. So, but when we keep that right center, that proper centeredness of Christ, of God, and then that impacts how we relate to the creation, to one another. So I think that's what my understanding is what he's getting at there.
Sometimes you see people who are very concerned with the environment or with nature and animals, more so than with their fellow human beings, and I think they kind of misalign priorities. I was saying, unfortunately, a few months ago, my dog went missing, and people came out, they helped, and I was trying to think the last time an Amber Alert went for a child, and you hear people say, "Oh, well, we hope they find that child." It's like, no, you should be more concerned about the child than the missing dog. And you should be concerned about, yes, the environment, but not just because it's the environment or a tree, but because we're all connected, and when there are, polluted rivers and air that's not good to breathe, that some of your brother and sisters who are less fortunate suffer more than you will because of it. And I think sometimes we forget to see the whole picture.
Yep.
We're almost near the end of our time here, and so we're going to ask just a couple more questions. Okay. The Holy Father writes about the interdependence of creatures in chapter 2. How is humanity dependent on the rest of creation? Would you like to answer that, Dr. Sakimoto?
I'm not sure I really want to answer that, but it's pretty clear. I'll tell you, you'll see why in a moment. It's pretty clear that our ability as humans to live on this planet depends entirely on the ecosystem, which we depend, because we are, for better or worse, the top of the food chain, right? There are rustlings in the wind, shall I say, in the research literature that give me great pause, and which are not reported very much to the public because they are preliminary. But in our oceans, the phytoplankton that produces most of the oxygen we breathe, I think, if I remember right, something like 70% of it, as the ocean temperature warms, they produce less and less oxygen. And if the temperature goes too high, we could run out of oxygen. And could temperatures get high enough to cause it to happen? Yeah. If we don't take actions against climate change, they could. Another type of algae, cyanobacteria, known as trichodesmium, which fixes nitrogen, it's the base of the food chain, could be on the verge of catastrophic collapse. There are laboratory experiments that suggest this. We don't know for sure because we haven't run the experiment in the real ocean, but we are running the experiment in the real ocean. So, we're talking, we usually talk about the immediate disasters, the fires and floods and all that, but total ecological collapse is not out of the question. We really need to be careful with how we're acting here.
The only thing I would add, this is the only planet we got. We don't have it. There's not a secondary choice. There's not a plan B to go to if we don't care for we need, as Dr. Sakimoto said, we need oxygen to breathe. We need the vegetation. We need the water. That if we don't care for this, if they don't care for this planet, where do we go? So this is God has gifted us with this planet, and we can't take that gift for granted.
And even if some of us have been privileged to not have to worry about clean air, or like today is a very hot, humid day and you can go into an air-conditioned building, if those, the least of us, suffer and can't survive through this, then how much longer can the privilege stay around? So it's something to think about, that we're all connected. The Holy Father writes about the universal distribution of goods in chapter 2. What does this mean, and is it a new concept? And how does it relate to environmental concerns?
I think we've already said earlier that common good, well, one of the key principles of Catholic social teaching is common good supersedes individual rights or privilege, and that it's not a matter, our Catholic faith has never said it's the survival of the fittest. That's never been a principle of Catholic church teaching. Again, the preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. I remember one time, if I may, and I won't get the numbers right, but I remember years ago when I was a parish priest, we had a passion as priests to do a parish mission for us, and it was on Care for Creation several years ago. And I remember one thing he said, and I was in a very affluent parish who was quick to give a lot of money to a lot of things. They were very generous people. And he said, if we really care for the poor and the most vulnerable, he said, it's going to take more than our money, because, and I won't get the exact numbers, but he said, right now the average American lives on something like 25, 26 acres to maintain the average lifestyle of American. And in the poorest countries, they're living on 1 acre, less than 1 acre for their lifestyle. If we want some kind of justice there and some more of a balance, we have to bring up that lifestyle for those poor and vulnerable. But our earth can't sustain 25, 26 acres for every human being on the face of the earth. So the only way that we can truly bring about justice and a balance for the poor and most vulnerable, we have to be, what are we willing to sacrifice of our lifestyle to bring up the ability, the reality of the most vulnerable lifestyle. So how do we bring that balance to all that? So that distribution of goods is, again, just making sure, what am I willing to sacrifice and give up in order for the most vulnerable and the poor to be able to have that same ability to appreciate and be nurtured and sustained by the earth.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that the Holy Father talks about again in his latest Fratelli Tutti, about the distribution of goods. So this is something that we're reminded of again in an urgent way. We'll go to our last question. Ultimately, the teaching in these first 2 chapters invites a deep reflection on our own habits and our moral life, which we just alluded to. How might we, as ever busy parishioners, priests, religious lay Catholics, and people of goodwill, what can we do to better embrace this reflection? Dr. Sakimoto?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that every action each of us takes, no matter how small, does make a difference, because little actions do add up. They create an attitude, a habit of being aware of your impact, of influencing others around us to act in similar ways, and so it matters. And a lot of times there are people saying that it doesn't make any difference, because after all, it's the big corporations or the politicians or something that controls everything. But guess what? We collectively control what they do. What we choose to buy controls what the corporations will produce. What we choose to adopt as our priorities absolutely influences what the politicians will do, because they know that we can vote them out of office. So every little action we take really does matter. On a larger scale, parishes and dioceses, I'm going to pause because I'm hearing just a horrible echo. Sean, can we do something about that?
Go ahead, Dr. Sakimoto. I think we're good.
Okay, let's try it again. Okay, thank you. On a larger scale, parishes and dioceses can make a big difference. The Vatican is in the process of developing what they call the Laudato Si action platform. It's out now in sort of a soft launch form on the web. And it's a 7-year plan in which they're asking every Catholic organization in the world to make a 7-year commitment to taking firm action in response to what is being asked from Laudato Si, in response to climate change and the other issues of our world. They may lay out 7 major goal areas that include response to the cry of the earth, response to the cry of the poor, adopting sustainable lifestyles, ecological education, ecological spirituality, and so forth. And the full platform will be released in October with the Feast of St. Francis. And so I'd urge everyone listening to think about taking a good look at the action platform and thinking about making a commitment within your own parish, your own diocese, your own community. There's also the availability through the Catholic Climate Covenant of forming a creation care team in your parish. Creation care team it's a lay ministry whose focus is promoting care for creation. How can we make things more sustainable within the physical plan of our diocese in terms of our lifestyles? How can we bring into the life of our parish a constant focus on care for creation through the music, through the liturgy, through the activities we do? And it's an easy thing to do because the covenant has like turnkey roadmaps that tell you how do you start a team, what do you do, who do you talk to. It's just really simple if you follow the plans that are laid out. So there are no excuses for not acting. And for creation ought to be a top priority. Because if we do not reverse the ecological damage we're doing now, if we do not slow and eventually stop climate change, then everything else we care about is going to fail. You can't care for the poor, you can't provide water, food, shelter, if the planet doesn't have an ecosystem that will sustain that.
It's well said. The only thing I would add is just simply is to reiterate a couple of things Dr. Sakimoto said, and that is parish, and the archdiocese, within the archdiocese there's a creative care commission. I'm sure the members of that would love to see that grow. Parishes can have their own commissions, their own focus on this. There's individual things we can do. I think back to St. Paul VI. He had a great line. I forget what the document's escaping at the moment, but he talked about, people are first attracted to us by our witness, by our witness of example. Then they listen to our words. So it has to be, as Dr. Moto said, it's what we're buying, what we're doing that's going to impact politicians and big businesses. And so that we have to give that first witness of not just saying something, but carrying it through in our actions and our behavior. There's individual things we can do day in and day out, whether it's recycling. Obviously, prayer is a key piece. We didn't say that, but it has to be rooted in prayer because Pope Francis says in his encyclical, there's reason for hope. But for us, the hope's got to be rooted in Jesus Christ. And as his disciples, how do we respond? Because rooted in him, no challenge is too big. Nothing is so overwhelming that we can't deal with it and address it. Especially as the community of believers. And so whether it's in these commissions in a diocese or in a parish, the individual things we can do, but always being rooted in prayer, that helps us to carry out the different ways that Dr. Sakimoto illustrated so well for us.
All right, so now we're going to move into questions. If anybody has any questions, we just have about a minute or two to get those. I do want to bring one up that we saw from Robert and said, what concrete practical steps can the dioceses and parishes in Indiana take to reflect Pope Francis's warning about the urgent nature of climate change? And I think, I feel like Dr. Sakimoto already answered that piece, and Archbishop Thompson has touched on it too, but brought up the Laudato Si action plan. So I think that's something in the next couple of weeks of this, we'll hear some more about that and get some more details. And we'll continue to flesh out what are the things that we can do in our lives, kind of doing that examination of of our own lives and how we
Yeah,
can better respond to this.
Yeah,
Another thing
Alexander,
that's
let me interject that
is
the
when
action
there are matters
platform,
before.
as it gets filled,
Go ahead, Dr. Sakimoto.
the action platform, the action platform as it gets fleshed out is going to contain just like long lists of suggestions for activities that you can do at the parish level, at the diocese level. So now's the time to think about organizing and make a commitment to a plan. And then as the details come out, there will be no question of what can we do, because the idea is you're going to pick from things in that list that make sense in your own community and then get to work on them.
Another thing I was going to suggest, as different proposed laws come before the state legislature, and the Indiana Catholic Conference has a position on laws that will either harm or protect the environment, stay aware and respond to the action plans.
Great, so we're at our time for today's live session. I want to thank Archbishop Thompson and Dr. Sakimoto for joining us, and really thank you, Angela, for moderating today. We're so blessed to have this conversation. We hope that you join us next week, Thursday, same exact time, noon on Facebook. We'll send out reminders as well. And it'll be with Sarah Mundell and Sister Sheila Fitzpatrick. We'll talk about the topic of integral ecology. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a blessed afternoon.
Thank you.
God bless.